Hello, welcome to WingChun Workout, bringing you content on training exercises for Wing Chun and WingChunWorkout.com, which is an online training library with exercises that you can do at home. Just want to let everyone know online that we have a membership for unlimited access to all current and future online courses at a discount. Just go to WingChunWorkout.com, click sign up, and then click on unlimited access membership, and you'll see the low monthly option there. Okay, so for this discussion, again, I have one of my teachers, Sifu Paul Wang. He is very influential on my Wing Chun path. He has degrees in biology and Chinese philosophy from Berkeley, California. Also a doctorate in acupuncture and Chinese medicine, and he's a licensed and accredited acupuncturist. You can check him out at daocenter.com or daology.substack.com, and that's DAO for Dao. And you can also check out his Instagram at Sifu Paul Wang, and that's Wang with an A, not an O. Hello, Sifu Paul, how are you?
Thank you. That was a key point at the end, yeah. Wang, yeah. So thank you for the introduction, and I look forward to another conversation with you, or dialogue. Sometimes I use the word Daologue because to me Dao is sort of a path of meaning and our actualization of our full potential. Some call it mastery, and so I love these kind of conversations where we can delve and go deep and go even broad on certain subjects. And if those of the viewers who have seen our previous videos and video clips, hopefully you appreciate our perspective. I personally, and perhaps because of my background and my experience, like to contextualize sort of these maybe common conceptions, and just like everything, they evolve over time. And what I like to do is zoom in and zoom out to different scales. So sometimes we get stuck on a particular level. Sort of like if you use a mapping app, you're just stuck at the, let's say the city level, right? And you never zoom in down to the city block or the street level, right? And you never zoom out to the country level, right? So you're kind of stuck at one. And so I think a lot of our progress in our studies is the sort of, you can say, cognitive flexibility, which then lends towards our embodied experience, right? So a lot of times, say you and a friend or a group of friends experience the same situation or even watch the same movie, and the movie itself is objective, right? I mean, you have different positions closer to the speaker on the left, or let's say you're pretty much centered and same distance away from the movie screen, but these 5 friends of yours have a completely different interpretation or opinion, right? And they got different sort of insights or maybe even complaints about the movie, and that's all based on their personal filters, right? So I think it's really important when we are studying, when we are trying to grow and learn, is that not to throw away everything that we sort of accumulated in the past, but always renew and have this principle of curiosity to dare to continue to explore the unknown, right? Some call it, maybe it's uncomfortable, and they call it ignorance, right? That which you don't know, and that feels bad to admit that or to go there. However, if you think about it, including those of you who have encountered this video or, like seeing Aaron and I meeting, there was at some point where we were unknown to each other, right? And so if we can kind of approach that, the unknown aspect of our knowledge with curiosity rather than fear, right? Or defensiveness. I think that's really important psychologically and philosophically. And then the creative part is then take that which you contacted of the unknown and bring it down. I like to say, make it your own. Take what you need, use your curiosity, go there, go to the mystery, go to the unknown, seek out teachers, watch videos, right? Not just watch videos, but also do, right? And so if you have questions, or if we have some courses like seeing Aaron or events, then it's also important to interact, right? Not just drink and receive, also interact. And then the aspect of creativity then is then to make it your own. Take what you need, curiosity, and then come back and make it your own. And we all come from different backgrounds and lineages, myself included, and we should respect and honor that. The work of those who came before us, as well as our current peers, as well as our students. I think that's very important too. Those who we pass it on. I think in this day and age, there is still, there is, I think, more and more this a doubt and distrust of authority for different reasons. And some people talk about, the dangers of an ego or guru complex. And it's true. I don't agree with those who abuse their power and position. That being said, I think it's important to respect those who have the experience and the virtues, and not take things too sort of casual sometimes. We should have some form of dedication and respect for those who we receive knowledge from. That being said, also see if it fits with your own values as well, including everything that we're sharing here today. May be a little bit different than what you expect. So I try to keep an open mind. And so I don't want to impose that on the listener or viewer, but hopefully you will find our conversation interesting. I know Sihing Aaron in our previous conversations have brought up a lot of interesting questions. So I look forward to presenting that together.
Yeah, those are all good points. Thank you for that. And that's a good segue for what we're going to discuss today, which are, I guess, common WingChun concepts. And they may not be like for WingChun or just martial arts or Chinese martial arts in general. So last time we spoke about things like yin and yang, relaxation. So one of the biggest things or topics in WingChun is the Centerline. And yeah, that's really, I guess, something that might be emphasized or overemphasized or misinterpreted or taken out of context. So I guess let's start off with what actually is the center line, because there could be like different interpretations for it. Some people think it's the the vertical midline or the intersection between the vertical and the horizontal, and you have like this part here. And that
Sure.
goes into what people how people practice the martial arts. Sometimes they like to guard this area and put their hands here, and they take it really far, as in do not deviate from this point. All attacks should be directed to that same point. Your elbow has to be at that point, don't move it, and the wrist has to be there.
Right.
So yeah, there's a lot of interpretations. So let's start off with what it actually is, if you please.
Yeah, this is a really, I think, important topic. And you're right. Every school, maybe members of a school, even individually, have different interpretations of so-called center line, right? And a line is a geometric abstraction, right? And if you think about a straight line, it doesn't exist in nature, right? Everything in nature has some curvature or irregularity. So we must acknowledge that this is a concept that sort of, let's say, humans, using our intelligence came up with. And so it's like a tool, and tools are, again, contextual, and they are important in a certain scope or range of function. So a common example of tools, like a hammer, right? A hammer is great. Pull it out of your toolbox when you're trying to nail something into the wall. But if you're trying to saw a piece of wood, then that's not the appropriate tool. You can try, right? And cut it or hit it with a hammer. It might break, but it's not so efficient or elegant or useful. So then you need to pull out your saw, right? And vice versa. A saw is good for cutting things, but if you try to use a saw to hammer a nail, then it's also not so efficient, right? And so I bring up that metaphor because, all concepts, right? And we're talking about, say, a specific, historically Chinese martial art called WingChun, or Chinese martial arts in general, or martial arts in general, or let's say movement in general, right? So if you have a philosophical or kind of a symbolic view of life, you're able to extract those principles that then can function in many different realms. So this context of using the right tool for the right situation, right? You can apply that to everything, right? And specifically about the center line, I think it's a tool, it's a conceptual tool to define an idiom, right? We have this idiom: the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line, right? So if I have my two fingers here, index finger, then the line that connects them, that's the shortest distance, right? Now here's the question. Is that the only pathway between my fingers, right? Actually not, right? You can go up and then down, or forward and back, you know, or zigzag, right? There's almost an infinite number of ways to go between my two fingers, right? However, this straight line is useful in that it delineates the shortest distance, right? And why is that important? Well, you know, rate times time equals distance, right? And so if you have the shortest distance, then at a given speed, let's say your maximum speed of punching, right? Then you can, you know, traverse that distance in the shortest amount of time, right? And the thing about time too, that's not in that equation, is energy expenditure, right? So obviously, if you are gonna, you know, let's say you exert 200 calories per hour, okay? I mean, that's a long time relative to punching, but let's just use that energy expenditure. So if you can get the job done in half an hour versus 45 minutes, you save energy, right? And in terms of survival as an animal, right? That's very important, right? Now, not so much, because, you know, 41% of, you know, United States Americans are obese. So I think we have plenty of energy. So in terms of center line, and the way that I'm describing center line now, like you said, there's different interpretations, is relative to the opponent, relative to the target, right? So it's like shooting an arrow, right? An arrow shoots relatively straight. Of course, it has an arcing trajectory. And so this way of considering the center line is very useful, right? And so if the opponent is in front of me, right? If I want to hit them, you know, with the shortest trajectory, then I want to make sure I'm kind of traversing on that line, right? And if they move, right, sort of like a compass needle pointing towards magnetic north, right? So relative to that, in this analogy, the opponent is due north, right? So if they move 30 degrees to my right, then that center line then actually deviates towards them, again, to define the shortest distance, right? If they back up, then that shortest distance increases, right? If they come closer, that center line decreases, right? So it's a very dynamic thing. That being said, right, are there situations where we don't want to obsess too much or overly apply the center line concept as I defined here, right? Again, there's different conceptions. And I would say, yes, in some situations, the shortest distance is not the best, right? And what do I mean by best? That's evaluation, right? Good, better, best. I would say safety, right? Sometimes it's not the most sort of advised to just jump right into the center line as I defined it, right? The shortest distance between you and the opponent. And maybe I want even to define it a little bit further, like which 2 points, right? Your forehead to their forehead, or your belly button to their belly button, right? So there's even that kind of variable now, right? Maybe I can define it as such, right? So maybe shoulder height, right? Your glenohumeral joint here, right? Halfway between, about where the sternal notch is. Why is that height important? Because when you reach out with your upper limb, that's your longest reach, right? If you reach above that line, that plane, or below, then you lose range, right? So if you want to strike, right, reaching out at that shoulder joint level, right, is a good default, right? Because you maximize the tool, in this case, your upper limb, as a striking implement. And so halfway between is a sternal notch. So perhaps my sternal notch to their sternal notch, okay, that's this first version of the center line. Now, I talked about safety. So I like to use a lot of parables or metaphors or even aphorisms. So if we all go to the roof of this building, let's say it's 10 stories tall, right? And we're enjoying the sunset, right? And it went down, and so we say, oh, let's head down, right? We want to go to happy hour together, right? To celebrate whatever, Christmas Eve or solstice. And so, your friend who is very much about, the shortest distance is best, says, okay, sure, I'll meet you there. And they proceed to go to the ledge of the building. All right. And I see them prepared to jump down. I say, whoa, what are you doing? Say, well, the bar is right there. I can see it from this 10-story. It's across the street. Right? It's about, let's say, 100 feet away. I don't know, something like that, right? 120 feet away. If I jump from here, that's the most efficient path. And gravity is working with me, right? I can just let go and zoom, right? And so I think, okay, very logical, very rational, very conceptually correct, right? Efficiency, shortest distance, and even this acceleration of G's, right? As you gravitational acceleration as you go down, great, right? So I say, I wouldn't advise that, but it's your life. But I love you, bro. So please step back from the ledge, right? What do you mean, right? So it's kind of a funny example. But maybe I let them go, I say, okay, you go ahead that way. I'm going to take a less efficient path, let's say. I'm going to go to the opposite side of the roof where there is a door that I have to open and walk through. And, let's say the elevator, there's no elevator in this building, right? And I have to zigzag all the way down, right? Those flights of stairs, all the way down to get to the bottom flight, bottom floor, and then walk out the front door and go across the street to the bar, right? And let's say that takes me, I don't know, like 15 minutes, depending on how fast I walk, right? Versus my friend, maybe 10 seconds, boom, splat, right? But that's the end of my friend, right? And it would be not so happy hour now. I'll drink a beer for him. Yeah. So it's a funny example, but as you can see, the principle of shortest distance, or even this elevation of, no pun intended, elevation of efficiency above all costs, right? And in this case, it's very costly, right? So in martial arts, let's say, in a self-defense context, you say, oh, the center line is free, the center line is open, right? The lane is open, right? And I'm gonna dive in. I'm gonna go through, right? And so the common scenario that I think people apply this is that then they think, okay, if someone is attacking off the center line, right? Say they're doing like a more round strike, right? So they're attacking in a more arcing off, lateral to the center line. And I think, oh, visually, right, with my tunnel vision upon this center line, oh, there's no one there, right? And so then I decide to strike. Now, most would, again, if you take it very mathematically, sure, sounds good, right? However, there's other variables involved, right? And again, we just can refer back to safety. I would say, okay, if you are 100%, or everyone has a certain risk, different risk aversion, right? If you are 100%, or let's say you would just require an 80 or 90% confidence that you can reach the opponent, let's say you're striking to their throat, before their arcing fist with that, angular momentum hits you, then go for it. Yeah. And I'm not being, facetious here, like go for it. Yeah, it's a good idea. Because then when you strike and you hit their target and their spine falls back, right? And if the spine falls back, the shoulder girdle also falls back. And then the shoulder joint and elbow and fist are connected to the shoulder girdle. So when you impact them, right, that collision is going to shoot back. And so that rounding strike may not be a threat, right? So go for it, yeah. So it depends. Maybe if you're a bit more conservative, let's say, right? And you don't want to take the risk. You're feeling 50-50 or even 60-40. Think you can make it, but you have more doubt. And again, it's very individual. Your own body type, your own nervous system, et cetera, your own expertise and training. you haven't done this sort of scenario very often. I mean, if you trained it, 100,000 times and you tested it and it works, 95% confidence, then go for it, right? But if you don't have that experience or whatever reason, right, then maybe it's better to forego striking on the center line for the time being, right? Maybe it would be a better idea to do some sort of defensive strike, right, to stop that arm from hitting your face first, right? So that is not to say then the center line abstraction disappears. It's still there, but safe sort of the safety first. I don't just to use this case study, safety first. That is defense. Make sure you're defensively sort of secure first, right? And offense second, right? And so in this case, then we would again forego and not strike on the center line first. Yeah. So let me pause there and see if there's any feedback on that, and then we can talk about other kind of definitions. That's kind of definition number one.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with what you said. It's almost like you have to take into account the distance and the timing as well. Like in your example, someone comes with a round strike. You have to make sure you time that pretty well because, I mean, no one's going to strike like a zombie.
Yeah.
So
yeah,
yeah,
exactly. Yeah, go ahead.
So I mean, yeah, so you have to take the timing into the account. It's almost like crossing the street, right? So
yeah,
there's cars whizzing by,
right, all right,
and yeah, you see that opening. If you're really quick, you can go through,
good.
but you don't want to run into a car.
Yeah,
just by going across the street. So
good example.
Yeah, I totally agree.
Yeah, that's a good example. Before I gave the building analogy, jumping off the building, I often give the analogy of a road, right? So they pave out nature with the asphalt, right? And so there's this 50, 60 feet wide asphalt, and so if it's a smaller road on a country rural area, then they don't go further than that, right? They just pave that. But most roads, right, if they're multi-lane, right, especially if they're two-way, right, you have to define a center line, right? And it's some form of dotted, white dash or yellow, depending on the country, right? And so if you have this road and then you define a center line, again, it's an abstraction, right? Why do you do that, right? In order to have, this control of the flow of traffic left to right, right? And so, or multi-lanes, right? Stay in the fast lane or, the slow lane, right? So you have this kind of limitation for safety, right? Now, it's just kind of funny. Sometimes I think, well, is the point then after you define a center line to then always to drive on the center line, right? So that's like, if you have the center line, so then I must strike on the center line, right? It becomes sort of fetishized, right? And it sort of becomes like a leash. And I don't want to strike off the center line because, these strikes, right, are the most efficient, shortest distance, right? So it's I think it's an oversimplification. It's where things move to, so it's kind of simplistic rather than simple. The center line is a good, simple and useful concept, but if you reduce the whole, reality of martial interaction to interaction on the center line, right, and it's very nice, right? Like, oh, all I have to do is hit on the center line, and it's kind of like you said earlier, like overextension of a concept, beyond its range of practicality, right? It becomes sort of a faith. I believe in the center line, so wow, right? And again, you may be lucky, and that it's like a religion, right? Okay, fine, believe in that, right? But some, let's say, philosophies or religions or even kind of scientific hypotheses incorporate more complexity, right? And so that kind of so the first way of using the center line is simply as an abstraction. Yes, I need it's useful to know the shortest distance between me and the opponent at this longest reach of my arms, right? Because the arms are most dexterous as a striking weapon, versus the legs. Good. So do I then go further and say, then that means I must always hit on the center line, right? And some even restrict the center line, right? What I'm saying here is like, as long as there's a target, there's a center line, as I defined. Some restrict that and say the center line is perpendicular to the plane of the shoulders, right? So it's shooting out 90 degrees here, right? So if my opponent is to my side, in order to punch, I have to turn, right? And I have to always have my center line, in this case, restricted to 90 degrees, orthogonal to my chest before I strike, right? To me, that's getting a bit limitation, right? That means if this is my center line and I only strike on my center line here and my opponent's there, then I can't hit like this. I can't hit laterally towards them. And to me, that's restricting the beautiful sort of dexterous potential of the human biomechanics, right? Why then start limiting that way, right? And then even this further idea of then some people say not only the fist, but the elbow has to press onto the center line, right? So I think it's artificially, in some contexts, yes, having the elbow towards the center. Now we're talking about vertical midline is good because you want to displace something hitting there. But then when you punch, right, to push the elbow, in the middle, to me that actually is limiting in different ways, right? It's actually against our biomechanics, right? And you lose range. You lose range by keeping your elbow on the center, right? Here, if I keep my elbow in the center, it's locked, right? Yeah. And once it start and I cannot leave the elbow, right? If I leave the elbow from the center line, I violate the center line principle, right? Whereas you're thinking, well, I just want to maximize the reach of my strike. Of course, my elbow has to come off the center line in that case. Yeah. So again, useful in a range, just like the hammer, right? But when we're in a different range, maybe you choose a different kind of concept, or you're not so fixated.
Yeah, and some guys, they don't have the flexibility, and like some guys have broad chests, and they can't, no matter how hard they try, they can't do it because I'm a pretty slim guy. I can do that, but a lot of guys can't do it. Maybe that's why they say, it's feminine martial arts for, invented by a female, whatever. But and even some people, they think it's protection, right? So protect this, this, which in my mind, I thought about this and I was like, that's probably the easiest part on your body to protect. I mean, and a lot of other martial arts, they don't have, they have this similar concept of center line. Actually, you could practice Taekwondo and have better protection. You just turn to the side and have your butt sticking out, and you can protect protect the center line.
This area.
Protect that area.
Yeah, so I use the metaphor of, different institutions of doctrine, right? Be them political or cultural or religious, right? Over time, especially if you don't interact with, outside kind of groups or organization, you tend to get a bit narrow. It's like inbreeding, and then your concepts only work within that small bubble, right? And so I know that's the critique of so-called traditional martial arts, right? I value tradition, but I like innovative traditions. I like traditions that are always renewing and creative, right? It's not just that he or she, said, the so-called great grandmaster said it that way 8 generations ago, and we have to do it exactly like he or she said. And the problem with that is that person is not alive anymore, and so it was transmitted, and hopefully there was fidelity, right? That from master to disciple. But the telephone game, right? You're sitting at a party and you tell your friend on the right side in their left ear, something, blah blah blah, and they pass it on. By the time it comes back around, it's completely different, right? And so maybe it's better with video, kind of footage. But nowadays, again, like I said, you have 5 people watching the same video or movie, and they have different interpretations. So even recording, if we recorded the grandmaster, from 200 years ago, and we're trying to learn from that video, we would still argue. Yeah. And so ultimately you have to make sense of it for yourself, and even test out these kind of, heuristics and algorithms that we're kind of offering here. And so this insistence of, kind of trajectory on the center line only, that's crossing a line, kind of pun intended. Now, there's other concepts of centerline, and so, you could say that, as we consider the physiology of the human body, right? Some people talk about, the centerline as a vertical one in the, let's say, the y-axis rather than the z-axis here, right? Going posterior to anterior, or vice versa, as a two-way lane, right? So then you have this idea of a vertical center line, right? That bisects left and right. And a lot of people, I think, they use that as a sort of a mapping of primary striking targets in terms of offense.
Yeah.
And again, I think as a yin yang sort of philosopher, I also think of vice versa always, right? And I think in a previous video, I recommended people, in order to keep learning and keep progressing, is to always work with that kind of yin yang dynamic. As you see in the yin yang diagram, right? It's that curve represents dynamic, not just cut a piece of a pie in half and there you go, right? And you just eat that half, right? So think about the opposite, right? So this is just a little application of that as well. If that's the case, let me flip it and say, okay, if those are vulnerable targets that I want to attack, then that means they're vulnerable targets that I want to protect as a defender, right? And so that's why, in most styles, they don't, have their arms open like this as their guard position. They have something where their arms are more medial rather than lateral, right? Yes, more lateral, like the shoulders, and the lateral knee, right? Those are more on the side of the body. Those are vulnerable, right? And I don't want to discount those as targets, right? But some people talk about the vital organs, like, let's say, the bridge of the nose, right? If you hit back, there's the ethmoid bone, which could damage your brain, or the eyes are pretty close here, right? The nose, right? The teeth, right? The tongue, the throat, which has the trachea, the esophagus, the carotid artery, the jugular vein, the cervical spine, right, et cetera, moving down, right? Then you have like the solar plexus, et cetera, down to the genitals, right? And so that, again, it's an abstraction. This vertical center line, right, along the y-axis needs to be defined, because that's sort of your central vital organs, or even the central nervous system is there. Now, that's not a bad definition. It's good to know left from right, right? Even our anatomy internally, left brain, right brain, et cetera, right? However, again, we can take the same idea of overextension of a certain definition of the center line, like prior, the more z-axis center line, that's kind of overly applied. So my point here is then, well, if someone is, let's say, their targets, let's say as an attacker, the defender, or the target person, me as the attacker, their center line is pretty well defended, or like you said, they're turned off, right? So it's not available, it's not full frontal. So, or they have defense, they have their arms here like this now, or somehow you step off to the side, right? You yourself, right, with a kind of a pivoting step or a side step, right? And so does that mean then, I can't attack them because their center line is not accessible, right? Then that's getting a little bit too far, because like you said, I studied biology and physiology, and also practice Chinese medicine, so some familiarity with the human anatomy. And we use needles in acupuncture, right? And I do primarily points off the center line. I almost never needle actually the center line, except maybe some points like in the forehead here to calm down the nervous system. Most of the points are on the forelimbs and the hands and the feet. So that's like the peripheral nervous system. Now, I'll tell you, you can ask my patients, right? Most of the time it's not painful, but they will feel a sensation, or sometimes maybe they do feel, for a moment, like, right, a little jolt of energy. And so my point is that the whole body is one integrated system, right? Connected by all the subsystems, like the circulatory system, right? From like the heart and aorta to these micro capillaries, or the nervous system, right? From the brain and like these bigger kind of nerves that run, efferently to the nerves on the periphery, right? So yes, when I am engaging with a body, whether medically or martially, I do consider where the vertical center line is. However, those aren't the exclusive targets that I use, right? And so one good target, for instance, that's off the center line, right, is, let's say, the ribs, right, the intercostals, where underneath is the liver, let's say on the right side, right? So say I sidestep, to the person's right, and their face, their throat, their solar plexus, their genital, right, they're not available. And so does that mean I don't attack, or I don't have options to attack? No, actually I would immediately strike off their center line, right? So that's a more planar idea of the center line. Oh, here it's accessible frontal. But another way to kind of make it a little bit more flexible is that don't think of it just as a planar thing. Think of it three-dimensional. So there is a point from the crown of the head down to the base where the perineum is. And so in the example where I'm hitting from an angle, not frontally, let's say to the liver, I am still directing my strike in towards that kind of pole, right? So rather than kind of hitting, say this is the person's body, right? Their liver is over here. So I'm not just skimming off to one side. I'm still hitting towards their, let's say, vertical center line, right? That way, when you strike, you're not just going to turn them, right? Unless that's the point. You can, no problem with that. Maybe you want to turn them, right? Then you would hit off center, so you get some of that lateral leverage, right? But if your idea is to really say, break something, right, or knock them back, then it's good if you attack towards that, sort of like if you think of a wheel, right, and you have an axle running vertically through that hub, right, like this. This metaphor is to understand that all spokes, right, all the spokes of the wheel, they go towards that hub axis, right? And so that's a good idea, whether you're hitting from, let's say, 6 o'clock or 12 o'clock or 3 o'clock or 9 o'clock, right, or 7:30, right? You want to hit towards that middle. That way you're going to affect their balance more, right? If you hit off that, then they might spin, they might rotate, right? So that's another way to elaborate this idea of the vertical definition of the center line.
Yeah, two things. So I like the way what you said, where there are other targets, because even when I practice with people or see other people practicing, I mean, you get pretty predictable if your target is the same spot. So if you're like center line, I guess, or what this point here, if you're that dominant, it's like, okay, I know where you're going to to strike each time now. So
predictable.
Yeah, you're pretty predictable. And another thing, like you said, because some people, they say center, but they may mean not necessarily the center line. They could mean the center of gravity. So it's sometimes you need to clarify what you're talking about there, because if not, some people could get misunderstanding.
Yeah, it's true. Yeah, center of mass, center of gravity, right? These kind of physics terms. I think the center of mass for most people, again, I mentioned obesity. And you mentioned it in terms of like if someone has a lot of bulk, right, and they're not able to, bring their arm towards the center line, the first definition of the center line. So maybe that would motivate them, right? Maybe to improve their lifestyle a bit, yeah. Or maybe it's a way to filter out all the buff people, right? So you don't have to deal with them. But the idea of the vertical center line, right? And then we have this anterior posterior, the Z line. They are, again, useful concepts. And I tried to give an example of, the Y and the Z axis, when and how it's useful. Center of mass, again, like you mentioned, is approximately at or below the navel of the body, right? So, so that's useful. That's a center point, not a center line, right? A center point of mass. So if you're kind of like acro yoga, where you're hanging someone, it's approximately a little, at the pelvis level in the lower abdomen. So that's why maybe you'll hear in the, Chinese alchemy or even Japanese martial arts. It's also in Chinese martial arts where they talk about the dantian or the hara, right? in Japanese, right? That's an important center where the kind of aorta comes down and splits to the femoral artery, right? There's actually a pulse there. So, I mean, if you want to stab someone, that's a good place to stab them, right? But my point there, another way to use that center point, right, is then as your center of mass. So if you're doing exercise, especially maybe you're doing tumbling, or rolling, it's good to have a sense of where your center of mass is, right? Because just like if you have a sword or something like that, right? Try to find where their balance point is. It more near the handle, right, or is it more near the tip, right? So it's good to know your weapon, right? So you can manipulate it with more ease around that center of mass, right? And same thing, your body is a weapon in a martial context. So it's good to know, okay, where's my center of mass? Is it in my head? Is it in my right elbow? Is it in my left pinky toe? No, it should be felt, proprioceptively or kinesthetically or interoceptively at the, around the lower abdomen. I think most people can feel it kind of rock around, even where you're sitting here right now. Okay, that's where my center of mass is. So yes, the vertical midline intersects with that center of mass point, right? Yeah. So maybe, then since I mentioned the, just kind of riffing here, but it's kind of seems like we're developing this model of a coordinate system, right? Where you have front, back, sort of a Z axis, and then a Y vertical axis, right? And so then you have a left, right, also like a X, right? In a coordinate system, X is left and right. So you're kind of moving lateral, medial, side to side. Like if you're on an airplane or a movie theater, we're kind of going down the rows, right? Excuse me. And then the Y-axis is where you stand up and down, right? Jumping up and down at that vertical from head to feet or head to perineum. And then you have the front and back, right? Which is the Z-axis coming to and away from the screen here. And so then you have a coordinate system. So what's useful about the center line, right? That bisects the upper and lower, right? So you have a line that bisects front and back. You have a line that bisects left and right, and then you have a line that can bisect upper and lower torso, let's say. Yeah, you could say upper and lower body if that horizontal left right x-axis. I have to define it as x-axis because this is also horizontal, right? So, but that's going front and back. So that's the z-axis. So the z horizontal, right? There's the x horizontal, which is left and right. So depending on where you define that, right? Do you want to define that as intersecting the same sternal notch here, right? Shoulder height, right? Or if you intersect it at the navel, right? Then you have an upper and lower body kind of definition. If you look at Leonardo da Vinci's Vitruvian Man, right? One person who I kind of consider being in the lineage of, right? He lived, he passed away 500 years ago. I went to visit his grave in France in Amboise. Anyways, so I like his conceptions, right? He has a lot of maps that he tried to draw and creatively understand the human body and even engineering and many inventions. So if you look at the Vitruvian Man, this kind of, some say it's a self-portrait, right? A naked man, right? Inside of a circle and a square, right? Maybe you could even fit an equilateral triangle in there. I mean, it's beautiful as an art. And I think it appeals to our sensibilities because it applies a lot of the golden ratio proportions that are in nature, right? And so when we apply that to the human body, it's not only is it beautiful, but then we also can tap into some universal truths, right? So not to get too far into esoterica, but I think a useful definition of the horizontal left-right x-axis is to define when you want to use techniques that defend the upper torso and the lower torso, right? So, some of you who are watching practice different styles, yeah? But if we use the WingChun vocabulary, right, we have something called Tan, which has come up in previous videos between us. Tan is kind of like this, right? I talked about it being kind of a spiral formation that covers this whole area, right? It can even go a little bit higher or a little bit lower, right? Now, there is a point where that defensive technique, defensive strike, defensive attack even, to attack the limbs of the opponent, like I said earlier, right? In that example, someone coming, from the outside, you can use a Tan-like shape to spread it out. I would say it's good to define then a water line, if you will, right, above and below, where the tan loses its scope of functionality, right? And in the body, I would say that's about solar plexus level, right? And because the tan fails against strikes that are below the elbow or slightly above the elbow, right?
Yeah.
So I can protect all the way up to here, right? So you could say on the body, for most people, that's about the solar plexus. And the solar plexus isn't important in and of itself for this sort of more geographic definition. In terms of like other practices like breath work or, you know, neigong or qigong, it is, right? In terms of internal alchemy, in terms of like surgery, right? There's a plexus there too, right? So it's a very important sort of neural area. But in this case, you know, we'll just focus more on the physicality of, about elbow or slightly above elbow is good to define a line, right? So we can categorize the scope of practice of our tool set, right? And let's say there's 50 tools. Well, it's good to define, in general, as a general sketch of incoming attacks. Like, am I going to choose the first decision, right? If there is and with training, it's almost like a subconscious decision. Okay,
Yeah.
is this incoming above or below that line of scrimmage right here? Is it above or below my solar plexus? You can take a quick snapshot. Oh, right, it's coming in from my left side, above, right? But maybe you see a little trajectory. Maybe it starts at, say, head or shoulder height, but it's kind of coming downwards, right? And by the time it reaches you, you can calculate that it's going to be below that solar plexus line, right? Or it's more level and it's coming and it's going to reach, say, your chin, right? So it's good to have this line defined, right? For that purpose, right? This is part of, again, the NI, natural intelligence, right? AI is all the rage now, right? But maybe this is a kind of artificial intelligence, right? That humans made up. It's kind of our concepts. Are they artificial? I mean, they're man-made, right? And so they're mapped onto, let's say, nature, right? To make sense of it. And again, to engineer a certain efficacy in a way, you can say, okay, that's good, spears and fire. But again, this kind of mechanistic kind of thinking taken too far, we're seeing some consequences of that, right? Overly trying to control nature for our purposes. But again, that's a side commentary. But if I continue this example, then okay, so let me say then, okay, the incoming, I'm able to observe that strike is coming below this X, center line, right? This left-right X-axis center line. That means maybe I thought, oh, maybe my hands are high, right? Maybe my hands are up here. But then the strike is coming below that. Then I'm going to forego, let's say those 50% of techniques that defend up here. I'm going to immediately go into my database and process of elimination, right? I'm not going to do, the tan or whatever strikes come up here. I'm going to choose a lower body defense, right? Yeah. And I can feel it, right? If you train it a lot, you can really feel that there's a line there. It's a virtual line, right? And so as the strike comes down, maybe I will convert my tan, and then in a WingChun parlance, maybe I'll change it to a gumsa, right, which is pressing downwards, or a gan, depending on where it's attacking my space, right? And so that's useful. That's useful. But again, like I said, it's a virtual. I threw out that, talking about AI, now I'm talking about VR. Or AR, right? A virtual or augmented reality without any, external tech. It's our own kind of ability to project, temporal spatial relationships that in a martial context can be useful for survival, right? Both in defense and also in offense, right? You can talk about these zones now, right? You have a vertical midline that divides left and right. You have this horizontal midline or center line that divides upper and lower, right? And then you even have this Z-axis midline. You could say divides front and back, because maybe you want to even consider there are strikes coming from behind you. But I think for the most part, you can say, yes, it's primarily in the plus Z direction, not the minus Z direction behind me, right? And so you can walk around like this, even in a non-martial context, just in terms of spacing, to have this virtual reality or augmented reality in order to understand external space, right? Which is very useful, right? When you are, in a crowded place, right? Or even when you are driving, right? So anything that comes into your temporal spatial physical space, having this psychological mapping of these triple center lines is useful, right? Now, I'm just presenting one version of it, right? Do you like this way of programming, virtual center lines? Maybe not. Maybe you don't like it. Maybe in your lineage you have a different definition, right? But I would encourage you to maybe question, not in a questioning or disrespectful way, but question, inquire, yourself or your teacher or your lineage, and see, maybe our idea of the center line is too limited, too restricted, right? Maybe we can expand upon that, right? And so maybe this kind of more generalized view of, we live in 3D, at least spatially. Maybe you can integrate it into your own practice.
Yeah, I've heard some teachers or teacher has like 8 center lines, which is just like, whoa, that's a lot. But yeah, I think I get where they're coming from. Another thing, maybe you could give some more clarification as closer into the center line is like the strength of your structure or technique. And maybe this goes into like the elbow in concept, because I think we discussed before that, I train like calisthenics and do all these types of like holds and tricks. And yeah, so that's true, where if you keep your elbows in closer to your body, you can balance better. And therefore you can hold these certain positions a lot better. So yoga does the same thing, right? But in terms of martial arts and Wing Chun, do you have any thoughts on the pluses and minuses of that?
Of having your limbs more
closer to your body, yeah, either lateral or closer into the body in like the strength aspect of your structure, and the pluses and minuses of bringing your limbs closer.
I could potentially have a lot to say on that, but let's see. So let's go with the leverage route first. So it's true when, let's say let's use a easy example, like if my arm is pretty extended, right? And someone wants to manipulate it. This is a long lever. And so if someone pushes here, right, at the peripheral position, the distal position, they have a lot of, I think in engineering physics, they call it mechanical advantage, right? Pushing here, right? If I resist, right? It's hard for me to resist pushing down, right? Versus if they push down my elbow, right? Because it's closer to the actuator here at my shoulder, I'm able to stabilize it more, right? Now, if they push very close, not at the joint, but very close, right? I almost have to not do anything, right? I can hold that up, right? So, and the same thing for lateral, right? If someone wants to, push my hand to the side, it's much easier if they push more closer to the distal versus the, closer proximal position. So that's true again for me and the opponent, right? And so if I want to control the opponent's limb, let's say in this case, then I will have more mechanical advantage if I can control more distal, more peripheral to their body. Now, again, is that always good, right? So it's true, I have mechanical advantage if I push more at the hand or wrist, right? But assuming they're not so rigid, right? If I push here, maybe then they bend their elbow and, right, they elbow me, right? So this is advantageous in terms of angular rotation, right? In a stiff position, wow, and they get rotated around, right? But if someone is more flexible and I try to control this point, maybe they elbow or they even, rotate back, right? So again, everything is contextual. So this, we have techniques like that in our movement vocabulary. So where do you want to, even if they have their arms extended like this, right? Where do you actually want to defend or attack or control their position, right? Is it always better, is it good to maximize your mechanical advantage and then hit more and control their, fingers, hand or palm or wrist? Or is it better to go to their elbow, right? And that's a whole nother thing. I know some, Wing Chun or other stylists say, oh, you got to control the elbow. So that's kind of another sub discussion. So I would say that, again, maybe you can kind of get to know us by now, like our philosophy is a bit more flexible and contextual, right? So obviously, if someone's arm like this, if you just control the shoulder, maybe that's not the best. They can still swing back at you, right? So it's very case by case, right? In terms of the strategy that you want to apply. In this case, again, we can say safety first. What's the most secure and safe position for me if I am going to attack the attacker, right? What kind of principle do I want to, or what kind of tactics do I want to use to apply that strategy of security? So one general thing I can say as a kind of this concept of more close and far is, if you look at your arm positions, right, when they're closer to you, there's more verticality to it, right? So in this case, if my arms are closer, let's say, from my knuckles, right, to my elbows, my forearms are occupying the space in front of about my throat or chin, about down to the solar plexus, right? So defensive positions in general should be closer to the body. It makes sense because they cover more of that vertical, right? You can say that y-axis space. So, defensive techniques, whether it's karate or whatever style, I don't want to talk about specific styles, then they're more close, right? These kind of positions like this, whatever shape, up, down, left, right, but your elbows are more bent, in other words, right? Your shoulders are more flexed, right?
Yeah.
Even like I said before, like in our kind of vocabulary, we have this tan, right? Would a tan be good if your arm is totally straight? No, because it doesn't have very much sort of obstruction, right, of this vertical plane.
Mm-hmm.
And so, is that bad? Yes, it's not so beneficial if you're trying to defend, right? Now, can we flip it and think, well, yes, it's bad in that context. Can we be creative, sort of martial philosophers? Or, this is all from application. It's not just abstraction. So when I'm thinking of my own personal experience, that when you want to defend, yes, better to have more angles because they occupy more space, right? It's just like a goalie, right? Recently, it was a World Cup. The goalie is not going to just stand there like upright, like they're gonna spread out, right? And they're even going to go forward, right? They're going to go forward from the plane of the goal, right, in order to cut off angles, right? So in defense, you want to have a lot of kind of more flatness, yeah. So you can, right? So you see that in sport too, like football or basketball, they spread out, right? More in this medial lateral kind of plane, right? Whereas if you want to attack, opposite, what was sort of wrong or not so beneficial in a defensive context is beautiful and perfect in an offensive context, right? Assuming that's more kind of middle range strikes, right? I need to have less angles, right? I need to, whatever strike it is, I need to be able to reduce the angularity of my limbs, right? Whether it's a kick or a punch, right? In order to to reach, right, the opponent, right? And also you're safe, right? You already did your defense, or they have no threat against me. Then kind of go back to the first point is that I can perhaps then strike on that z-axis center line, right?
Yeah.
And I can lose all the angles of my arm to get full extension.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like what I tell people is, and this goes into, I guess, the concept of contact or chi sao, and maybe we could discuss that in another video. But I tell people, if you want to attack, the same thing you said, you don't want any sticking or anything, right? But if you want to defend, you want a kind of a contact there. So so if you want to defend, you want kind of like an X, right? This is how this is like how I explained, simply explain things. You want a cross. If you're attacking, no cross. You want to slide straight past. So I think what you said was very cool there. So.
If we use the coordinate system that we talked about, then if you want to defend, right, you want to create more intersectability, right, with the opponent. I mean, if we quote the late Xiaolong, Lei Xiulong, right? The little dragon that he talked about intercepting, right? The way of the intercepting fist, Jeet Kune Do, right? And so actually that's a very defensive definition, right? Of at least in one way of understanding, what is meant by Jeet Kune Do. It's like intercepting the fist is kind of like what we're talking about. More
Yeah.
intersection in let's talk about planes now, not axes, right? Two axes define a plane. So if we're talking about the Y and X axis is this frontal plane, right? So if you want to defend, you want to occupy more of the XY plane, right? More of the XY plane, right? Like you said, it could be a diagonal cross or like a plus sign, like a upright cross or diagonal, right? But in any case, you want to define and defend this XY plane. Whereas if you want to attack, right, then you want to occupy more the Z axis, or you can say the ZX plane, right? This is the ZX plane, like a tabletop, right?
Yeah.
Then you want to occupy those more, right, and go forward in that kind of direction, and not not kind of reserve yourself to the XY kind of frontal plane. I think this is called the transverse plane, I believe, right? And then you have the sagittal plane, which is the YZ plane, yeah. And so, not to misquote Bruce Lee, I think by interception, sometimes we've also talked about attacking the attack, right? If someone's going to punch you, you kick them, right? So it's not purely this more defensive strategy. So what we're talking about is more, let's say, more safety, more conservative, which is not bad, right? Is it possible to have a style which is just purely attacking? Yeah, sure. Right. And if you apply that well and you have zero defensive, it's kind of more like boxing in a way. I mean, they have kind of like body movements and footwork, but not so many blocks. Like in more, let's say, classical traditional systems, there's maybe a dozen or 2 dozen types of blocking. Whereas in say boxing, it's more of an offensive, more of a progressive system in terms of attacking. They have some guard positions, right? But mainly it's these attacks, right? So again, it's I like to talk in terms of a variety of different scales of frameworks, and be flexible in their application. So I can have a lot of interesting conversation with people of different styles and lineages who apply subsets of these abstract frameworks. So I think to have wisdom, let's just use that terminology, is to be able to hold multiple maps in mind or in body at one time, and also part of wisdom is to be able to select which mapping is the most appropriate for that split second situation, right? So, if you want to say, where exactly is, Lithuania, right? And you pull out the map and then, you are zoomed into the street level, right? That doesn't make sense, right? But maybe your style is to always by default set to, from 1 to 7 at the 2 level, which is the street level, right? And you don't even see the countries, right? Right. And so if you're looking for a country that you don't know, then you want to zoom out, right? And see one of those, I don't know, there's 200 something or whatever, somewhere between 150, 200 countries. Maybe there's more. But anyways, you zoom out to the country level, you see Australia, the continent country, you see Brazil, you see, Germany, and then, there's Lithuania, right? And so is one right or wrong? I mean, now, if you want to find a specific intersection, right, Main Street and 6th Street, then you need to zoom back in to, deeper than the country level for sure. You don't see those street intersections at that level, right? So a lot of the, discussions that kind of, devolve into confrontation and conflict and even so-called, war, if not informational, then, talk about martial arts, right? Let's fight it out, right? Okay, is due to kind of just mutual limitations that don't overlap, and so in other words, a lacking of wisdom, right? So yeah, so I hope that what we discuss isn't just hypothetical and theoretical for that. Again, we're doing this as a video, so that's our media, that's our means. But I hope people can apply some of the frameworks or perspectives that we threw out, or maybe from their own experience they can already understand, like, what they're talking about makes sense or doesn't make sense, right? So everyone has their sovereignty and their agency to apply it in their own individual way and in their kind of community of training. But I like this idea of an ecosystem of practices and principles, not just a monoculture, right? Let's burn down the ecosystem with 1,000 species and just plant soybean, and a specific soybean that's genetically modified that's resistant to the particular herbicide that you also sell. So I think nature, there's a ecological succession, from any kind of barren area, of species, but usually, the most healthy kind of ecosystems have a biodiversity, just like our body has a biodiversity of the bacteria, right? The microbiome, if you're healthy. So same way, conceptually, like most people, I think, get stuck because they have a monoculture of mind. They're not able to have a plurality, or what I like to call a unity of diversity, and be able to self-select depending on the context, what's most useful. And if someone has a different perspective, you're able to, with your wisdom, to meet them at least halfway, rather than say, no, that doesn't make sense within your little box.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good place to, or a good summary of what we discussed here, or I guess throughout all of our discussions, something to just take away. Because like you said, these concepts are not necessarily bad. I mean, but I would say they're, instead of just rules to never be broken, they're guidelines to be used in context, and you have to view the whole thing, in context with everything else, other than just concentrating on one thing or being a little bit over simplistic. But I like everything that you said here.
When you said go ahead. When you said that, I thought about the road again and those lines, right? Now, if you were driving on the center line, right, straddling the center line between two lanes, I think you'll get pulled over by the police, right, and say, "What are you doing here?" Like, what? I thought this is the center line. You have a road and it's bisected like this, and on the z-axis. And Sifu Paul said, "No, don't drop my name." But it's kind of funny, right? And now another kind of aspect of that, say, like you're driving and it's 2-lane, right, and you have slow lane and fast lane, right, and there's a dotted line between, and you're in your lane, okay, and there's another line on your right side, which is a solid line, right, that you don't want to cross over, right? That's not allowed to cross over. But what if up ahead there's a giant big rig truck that's spinning out of control, right? And it's coming towards you, right? Now, in that case, are you going to be limited by, and it's occupying the 2 lanes, right, coming at you, right? Are you going to be limited by that white line that some guy drew, like a month ago? I would say no. I am crossing that limit, right, and driving into the so-called shoulder, even if there's a little ditch there, right, and sort of violating, like you said, that rule, that limit, right, because there's a higher, kind of value here, which is like survivability, right? And so that's just kind of little. I think a lot in these kind of scenarios, so there's, I think, a thread that kind of runs through our conversations is that, the martial field, the martial paradigm is really beautiful, really useful. And I think in our first conversation, I believe that everyone should have that kind of warrior aspect, that kind of animal nature, that often is domesticated out of us, that would be advisable to keep, even for just your health, and your embodiment. A lot of people are unhealthy because they're all stuck in their head, right? And these principles, I hope people can see, is that even if you never step into a dojo, they also apply in your day-to-day life.
Yep. Yeah. Sorry, my video just
That's okay.
went out there.
Yeah.
But
no
I think it's it's about time, and
maybe that was a sign, right? That was a sign.
But thank you, Sifu Paul. Again, you also you always have some good Wing Chun wisdom for us, and I hope to be talking to you soon. And yeah, everyone watching, please go check out his material, the Tao Center, Taoology, is where you write all of your, or that you have some of your writings and things like that. So, and also the Instagram, Sifu Paul Wang. And you can check what I have going on as well. So, well, we kind of partner together, at least on these discussions, right? But
Yeah.
WingChunWorkout.com. Again, we have a special going on right now that you can take advantage of. Visit the site. And Sifu Paul, I wish you a happy new year.
Yeah.
And many more to come.
Yeah, thank you so much. I just want to say this probably is our last conversation for this particular year, but thank you for your initiative to kind of start these kind of sharings of perspective. And it's been very, I think, useful to get some of this knowledge or wisdom, as you call it, out there. And so I appreciate that. And I also appreciate everyone who has spent time to tune in, because as we know, there's so much out there. And so somehow serendipitously, you found your way to this video. And I want to honor the fact that you chose to kind of receive what we offered here. So yeah, happy end of 2022, and look forward to 2023 with you all. Thanks again.
Bye.
Bye-bye.